we live. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving the relationships between nations, in deepening our own understanding of the local indigenous peoples and their cultures, as well as our shared responsibility with regards to the environment. The Ganyan-Kayaiga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, or Montréal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it is a place where First Nations and many other people cohabit. The Pier Paolo Pasolini reprise, I said it in the wrong order, sorry about that. Represe Reprise Retakes Conference is an event that was co-organized by Concordia University, UQAM, the Italian Cultural Institute in Montreal, and St. Paul University in Ottawa. It celebrates the 100-year anniversary of Pasolini's birth through a series of screenings, artist talks, and academic conference. This event is funded by a SHRC Connection grant, and supported by Concordia's Faculty of Fine Arts, and of course, the wonderful people at ForSpace. We're very, very happy to host this event that brings together research, creation, and of course, research creation. Those are the three main fields of inquiry at Concordia's Faculty of Fine Arts, and it's one of the aspects that has made our faculty a leader in Quebec, Canada, and beyond. I want to give a shout out to Luca Caminati and Rosanna Moll, who initiated this project. They're both pillars of the Concordia's Film Studies program, and I think that their students who are here today, their colleagues, but also our graduates who are participating in this event will benefit a lot from the discussions that are going to be happening through this event. So on this, I want to wish you all a very productive conference and a great screening. Bon cinéma.
Do I keep it? Do I get to keep it? Hold on a minute. Can you hear me? Yes, excellent, wonderful. So I'm going to put this here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the Dean for coming. I'm going to explain very briefly what's going to happen and what has been happening up to now, and then I'll introduce our panelists for today. So this is a project that started, I think, more than a year ago, and it includes a group of people from Montreal and beyond. So myself, my colleague Rosanna Maule, and Ilenia Olibet at Concordia, Caroline Bem and Julie Paquette at Université St. Paul in Ottawa, and of course Viva Paci at UQAM. We will be at UQAM tomorrow for the second part of our conference. We have been working on gathering funds, places, films, and this Pasolini extravaganza, how we have been calling it lately, is becoming really big with the series of screenings at the Cinematheque, and these next 4 days will be the clue event of this. The original idea came to us when we found out that Pasolini was in Montreal in 1966 to present his film Uccellacci Uccellini. So the idea was to bring back Pasolini to Montreal one more time. And rather than think about Pasolini dead, we wanted to bring back Pasolini very much alive. So we were interested in its legacy, its afterlife, its impact on artists, thinkers, scholars, and everything in between. We sent out a call for paper. We received a massive amount of support for this project. And here we are. We'll start today at ForSpace. Tomorrow we will be at UQAM. Friday, we will be back at Concordia in De Sèvres, which is the very large cinema on the right of here. And then Saturday, we will take a bus to Ottawa to go to St. Paul. And God have mercy of us. And said that, all this has been possible thanks to the help of many people that have been working very hard to help us put this together, but maybe we'll thank them as we move forward. So, since I don't want to take up too much time, I would like to introduce all of you right now, and then I'm going to let you go with it, right? We start today with 3 artists, or research creators probably, as we would call them in Canada, who have been engaging with Pasolini's work, Pasolini legacy, and that they become very much involved in this project of reprise, retakes, right? Rethinking Pasolini. So the first speaker will be John DiStefano, who is a visual artist, filmmaker, and academic. His interdisciplinary research focuses primarily on how concept and perception of memory, space, place, and time shape the articulation of subjectivity, so as to reconcile the personal with the social, the everyday with history. His academic and exhibition career spans over 30 years, and his studio practice is focused primarily in video, installation, and photo-based media. His video work has been broadcast on American public television and has won several awards, including the New Vision Award at the San Francisco International Film Festival. Dr. DiStefano has curated several international projects, and his critical writings appear in various international journals and publications. And you are a Concordia alum, if I remember correctly. Yes, thank you. Our second speaker, the dean is gone, unfortunately. Our second speaker is Frédéric Moffet. Fred is a media artist, educator, video editor, and cultural worker, and a Concordia alum. He lives between Montreal and Chicago. His work explores the slippery territory between history, lived experience, and fantasy. His projects include Horsey, Fever Freaks, whom some of you might have seen Sunday at the Cinematheque, The Magic Hedge, Adresse Permanente, The Fateful, Postface, Jean Genet in Chicago, Heart Fat, and the upcoming Goddess of Speed. Screenings include Oberhausen Film Festival, Rotterdam Film Festival, National Center of Contemporary Arts in Moscow, Whitechapel Art Gallery in London, Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the PPOW Gallery in New York, and the Biennial of Moving Images in Geneva. Our third and last speaker is Cathy Lee Crane. Cathy has crafted lyrical films of speculative history since 1994. She is not a Concordia graduate. She is the recipient of the 2013 Guggenheim Fellowship in Film and Video, and has been named the 21-22 Artist in Residence at the Farocki Institute in Berlin. Her body of work received its first survey in 2015 as part of the American Original Now series at the National Gallery of Art. Pasolini's Last Words, 2012, enjoyed numerous international screenings in conjunction with the 2013 Pasolini Roma exhibits in New York, Paris, and Berlin. His most recent film, Crossing Columbus 2020, is part of Drawing the Line, an ongoing multi-platform project exploring how the western boundary of the US-Mexico border came into being. This project was developed with support from the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Research Center, and she's professor of cinema at Ithaca College. All right, well, help me welcome all our speakers, and the idea is to let them present their work related to Pasolini, their personal artistic relationship to Pasolini, and maybe at the end we can have questions for all of you. So, John.
Thank you. I've got a PowerPoint, and actually I will be showing many images, so you might want to start. I think we all will. So you might want to start to kind of orient yourself towards the screen. All right. Thank you, Luca. Very happy to be here. I have been involved, to not say obsessed, with Pasolini from a very young age. In fact, I was talking to Tom Waugh earlier. When I was an undergraduate here, I was already very much involved in discovering Pasolini and in thinking through kind of responding to Pasolini's work. And what this presentation will be is a bit of an overview of that trajectory. It's not comprehensive, it's not encyclopedic. We'd be here for hours, I think, if I were to do that. So I'm going to kind of do a kind of a two-part presentation, giving a little bit of a context in terms of the genesis of my interest in kind of making work about Pasolini, what I call the Pasolini project, which I kind of give these kind of random dates to 1990 to 2022, although it's an ongoing project. And I'll kind of gloss over a lot of earlier work, and then in the second part, I'll focus on more recent works from about 2013 and culminating in a short film that I made a few years ago, which will screen in its entirety. So, see if this works. It's not working. There we go. It's working. All right. So I guess just to give some sort of context in terms of my approach, it really is a kind of a revisionist approach. Certainly in the kind of early works that I made about and around Pasolini, and I guess I put these kind of two kind of words here, queer and immigrant/transnational. Those are the kind of perspectives I think that or the optics that I'm kind of looking through in relationship to my approach in the earlier work. So as a queer maker, as a queer subject, and also as an immigrant/transnational subject, being the son of Italian immigrants, offers me a kind of perspective, or I'm kind of seeking certain things from Pasolini, as well as a queer maker. So hopefully this will become a little bit more obvious. I cite three works that have nothing to do with Pasolini, but just to give you a bit of a context also, each one of these works they're separated by 10-year periods, just randomly, actually, as it may seem. And I think they're works that I've made also with this idea, this revisionism, sort of embedded in them. They're essayistic works. Sometimes I call them experimental documentaries. They really try to engage with this idea of revisiting history in a variety of different ways and through a variety of different modalities. Tell me why the epistemology of disco talks about disco music and tries to reclaim it as a part of the gay history, and certainly within the context of AIDS. Hub and You Are Here are more focused around the idea of sexuality and nationality, so just as kind of reference points. But let's talk about Pasolini. So the first rubric is images, and the first, I guess, artwork, or the first work that I would consider worthy of mention is a performance slide show / lecture that I gave in 1991, and yes, that's me. While I was a student doing my master's at UCLA, it was a conference very similar to this one called Pierpaolo Pasolini, Life After Salò, at the UCLA Film and Television Archives. And I was invited to speak, and I kind of resisted doing a traditional kind of academic paper, mostly because I was interested in sort of transgressing some of the conventions of authority that often are, surround conferences. And so I decided to do a kind of performance where I kind of started off as John DiStefano, and by the end of the lecture became Pierpaolo Pasolini. And I didn't wear glasses at the time. Now I do, but so the glasses were the kind of signifier that I had become Pasolini. So I was kind of oscillating between two voices, one John DiStefano and the other potentially Pasolini. So the important thing, though, was that it was a slideshow, and what I had done is I had accumulated through a lot of visual research images of Pasolini. This is before the internet, might I add. So it was a much more arduous process of going to archives, and I had assembled, I can't remember how many, but at least 40 or 50 images that I kind of spoke about. But I spoke about them, I tried to give them a different context. I tried to read between the lines, look at the subtext of these images, and do a kind of critical reading, if you will. So that kind of set the stage, that kind of modality, that kind of idea of revising. And in fact, this is from an essay that was published a few years later, but the opening line was, and I'll read it, "Like many children, I kept a scrapbook even before I knew who he was, had read any of his poetry, or had seen any of his films. I collected in it images of Pier Paolo Pasolini. Pictures of Pasolini were abundant in the Italian language magazines and newspapers that were lifelines to my parents' native country, to their native language and culture. These publications served the same purpose for me. Between the mid-60s and well into the 70s, magazines such as Gente, L'Europeo, Oggi, Epoca, Amica, Panorama, and newspapers such as Il Messaggero, La Repubblica, Corriere della Sera were passed around, read, and then piled up in corners all around our house." So it gives you a little bit of a kind of perspective on where I was coming from. So one of these images, an image that interestingly has been doing the rounds lately on the internet again, is a very famous image that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, of Pasolini at the opening of Acatone being accosted and assaulted by neo-fascists who found the film to be questionable, let's say. And here Pasolini caught on camera, and of course circulated in newspapers as he was defending himself by neo-fascists. So this idea of revising or looking at these paparazzi photographs which sensationalized Pasolini and marginalized him as someone scomodo, someone diverso, someone who's uncomfortable, who's different, permeated and were always the subtext of these images that circulated in the press and in fact plagued his entire life. A lot has been written about this, I won't go into it too much, but at the time I wanted to make images of Pasolini that kind of countered that, and I made the series, which I call Tenebre in Italian, meaning darkness. They're Polaroid, they're large format Polaroid, so already a Polaroid being a singular photograph that cannot be reproduced, it's a one-off. And I used very low contrast, and you can, if you look carefully on the image on the right, you can actually see that there is a Pasolini in there somewhere, actually Pasolini writing. And what I did is I looked at a lot of these paparazzi and media images, and I cropped them in such a way to focus on their gesture, on the humanity of the gesture, if you will. Again, I'm not going to speak too much about these, but just to kind of give you a sense. And so here's a source image, which then became the image on the right, and you can sort of see Pasolini in the darkness, sort of emerging and not emerging. So there was kind of a stylistic thing. I mentioned, this is a bit of a sidebar, but I'm often asked about this work by Mike Kelly on the right. Those of you who are familiar with contemporary art will recognize Mike Kelly as being, unfortunately died a few years ago, but being a very important contemporary artist. And while I was a student at UCLA, I was shooting a video on Pasolini and casting, and that is my very crude casting poster on the left, which I plastered all over campus. And Mike Kelly happened to have been on campus and picked it up and made an artwork out of it on the right. So no, it's not me. If you see this at the Whitney or whatever museum, it's not my work, it's Mike Kelly work. But what I found interesting about this work, other than being flattered that he used my poster as a basis for an artwork, was the black marks or the black spaces in that and his rendition. Now, he did that for privacy and for copyright, no doubt. But that black, where the image should be or would be, was something that I think that I sort of picked up on, and perhaps it was a way or signaled to me anyways, a way of sort of resisting the sensationalism of these kind of paparazzi images. But back to me, back to this project. So there are many works that I made during this period, a lot of them photo-based. I was primarily working as a photographer at the time, or working in photography, I should say, but also beginning to make video works and film works. And a project like this, November 2nd, 1975, which I'm sure some of you will know, the date of Pasolini's assassination. to me, marked the end of the biography of Pasolini, and so I wanted to sort of signal that. And this work, it's an unbound bookwork. It had a couple of iterations. This one is its final iteration in 2003, where I collected all of the texts, all of the images that I had amassed through my research, and kind of created this compendium of my research through imagery. So you can see there's images of Pasolini in there, childhood photographs, images, Caravaggio images, all sorts of stills from his films. And it became, like I said, a kind of archive, if you will, a kind of personal archive. Several artist projects I was asked to do. This one for publication, edited by John Grayson, Martha Geaver, and Pratibha Parmar. Queer Looks, Perspectives on Lesbian and Gay Film and Video from 1993. And this was sort of an insert, kind of an artist project. And I kind of mimicked the idea of image and captions, except my captions were trying to do a kind of a revisionist reading, and certainly through a kind of queer perspective. But also, I started to add more fictive things. In fact, my affair with Pasolini, as if I had an affair with Pasolini. So there's a lot of it was propositional in a lot of ways. And so the mixing of these kinds of currencies of truth and fiction started to emerge here in this work. Okay, thank you. And finally, culminating in 1997 for Art Journal, I was asked to submit a work. And what I did is I kind of did the kind of greatest hits from the Ashes of Pasolini, and did a more in-depth reading, I guess, of some of these images that I had been carrying around and reworking over the years. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but you can see some of the images that I've already spoken about. For example, the image from Acatone. There's a whole section on Pasolini's aging body and the way that it's depicted through some of these images. Also, his relationship with Ninetto Davoli, his affective relationship with Ninetto Davoli, which was always never overtly kind of articulated in the Italian press anyways. But I sort of did a sort of subtextual reading of this gay relationship, this queer relationship that Pasolini was very much involved with. And finally, it ends up with an image that a very gruesome image, and an image that I'm always very ambiguous about reproducing, but for this talk, I think it's a good context. And it's the image, the last image we have of Pasolini. The Pasolini, the image that the police leaked, quote unquote, to the press. Horrific image of his corpse the morning after it had been discovered by the police. And it's an image that, as gruesome and as horrific as it is, I wanted to reclaim, and I wanted to find I guess, a positive interpretation of. And so the last line, or the last section of that published piece reads as follows. On November 2nd, 1975, the police provided the final image of Pasolini's body. It was meant to give closure to Pasolini. This image of Pasolini's beaten body and crushed corpse was doubtless intended as proof that the gay body cannot survive in this society, and that Pasolini's body has been squelched. The gruesomeness of this image and the fact that it was even considered fit to print send a profound and horrific message to anyone who dares challenge the order and assert his or her difference. This image legitimizes gay bashing. It glorifies and warrants violence. It celebrates hatred. It is a testimony to the fears of a society. It's to theorem that I looked to find some kind of answer or some kind of justification or some kind of means forward to reclaim this image. Theorem is a masterpiece, in my opinion. So much can be said about it. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to do that here, but it's always a film that has resonated for me on many levels. But not only as a film, also as a novel, or as a let's call it a novel. It's more of an experimental kind of novel, they kind of work in tandem. And I've always seen both the film and the novel as a kind of a dual probe into what is essentially, at least in my opinion, Pasolini's 1968 manifesto. It really is probably the most pointed, certainly during his film career, of that moment, that 1968 moment, that critique of consumerism and of capitalist culture. So it's in, I think I'm going to have to give you, I'm just going to have to tell you to, yeah, thank you. I'm talking to the technician in the back. The sort of next phase of this early period of working with Pasolini, which focuses more on text than on image. Next slide, please. And so I made a work called Theorem in 1998, which was a video projection work made for an exhibition in Chicago called Textuality. So it really was about text. And I tried to find a reasoning, a logic for his assassination, for his death. And rather than look at all the many analysis that had been done over the years around this incident, I looked to the film itself, but not even to the novel or to the book, but actually, next slide please, to the subtitles. So I lifted the English subtitles off of the Italian film, the Italian language film, and isolated them and reprojected them onto, or through, I should say, this transparent screen within which this image of Pasolini's corpse is embedded. And so it's as if the corpse were sort of wasn't as opaque to be in sort of formal terms, and was perhaps sort of floating away, or perhaps had sort of been unanchored from the kinds of media sensationalism that had was originally its context. Now, what can the English subtitles give to us? No real reason, no real explanation, no direct explanation, but perhaps if we read between the lines or between the image and these almost nonsensical kind of texts, there might be a space there to start to think differently about this body. And so here is it's very hard kind of work to document, but you get the idea. The work lasts the length of the film itself, and every once in a while where someone speaks in the original film, obviously the English subtitles follow, and here's a string of them just to give you an idea how it works. But you could very well enter the gallery and there's actually nothing happening until some of these subtitles sort of appear. Next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, back. Can I go back a slide, please? Back, please. No. Back. Back. One more. Thanks. So another work I made with this idea of text or focusing on text was this work called Volgare Loquio, which was also a collection of texts that Pasolini published, or were published in, I believe, 1975, if memory serves me correctly. And a Volgare Loquio in Italian, a vulgar address, would be a literal translation. And what I did is I wanted to kind of focus on, thanks, Cathy, focus on a kind of more performative use of text, and essentially it's a wall projection of a film, a poem by Pasolini, Versi del Testamento, lines from the Testament, from 1969, which I type, and it takes about 17 minutes for the poem to type out in its entirety. Let's see if we can look at an image of that. Can I have the next slide, please? Can you play it? Thanks. So it's a poem about solitude. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's a very well-known poem by Pasolini. And what I wanted to evoke here is not only the poem and the fact that you have to sort of sit through 17 minutes of someone typing this poem to kind of read it and understand it and engage with it, but there's also the specter of Pasolini that I wanted to evoke. Who is actually typing this? One might say it might be Pasolini himself, although we don't see. We have a different, the camera is focusing or is framing the words being typewritten, but not the actual person typing it. Can I have the next slide, please? And a sister work to this, and so these images were very inspirational to me, and the Olivetti Lettera 22 typewriter, which was kind of the Pasolini's apparatus. There was the camera, which was an apparatus, of course, for the filmmaking, but there was the typewriter, which was the apparatus for writing. And I, not to fetishize this, but it became a kind of touchstone for me, this typewriter and this particular model of a typewriter. Can I have the next slide, please? And so following Volgare Loquio was this work, kind of in response to Volgare Loquio, senza parole, without words in Italian. And here the Olivetti typewriter appears, an empty chair appears, perhaps where Pasolini might have once sat, or where perhaps is even sitting now, although we don't see him. And there's on the typewriter itself, where normally words would be typewritten, we have a video projection instead, and it's this video projection to the right. Can I have the next slide, please? And it was an excerpt from the title sequences of La Ricotta, which was a short film, part of a compilation film made in 1963. And La Ricotta stars Orson Welles. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. But within the title sequences of this film was embedded what I've always found to be an incredibly transgressive image, and that's of these two men doing the twist together. Nowhere else do we see these characters in the film, but they're given prominence in the title sequence, in this sort of marginal part of the film otherwise. And so, but to me, again, through a queer optic, I guess, it's an image that resonated tremendously. Can I have the next slide, please? Can you activate it? It's a video clip. Thanks. Oops. So you see that what I do is again, very difficult to document this work because of the light shifting, but you can see I slow down the frame rate, and it becomes a much more overt kind of sexualized dance between two men, which would otherwise have kind of flown under the radar, or perhaps wouldn't have warranted such interest, but to me, as I said, it was quite a radical image. And so another way of sort of reclaiming Pasolini. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so here are Volgare Loquio and Senza Parole together. They really are kind of a dual work, I guess, or I really see them as being sort of two sides of the same coin, installed in a gallery setting. Next slide, please. My interest in text went beyond literally text, and I made this work called Cenere, Ashes, evoking both the ashes of Pasolini, but also the ashes of Gramsci, a book of poetry that Pasolini wrote in '54, if I'm correct. Pasolini scholars may help me here. So it was basically a pile of ash. And onto it was, again, me playing Pasolini. And it was a script. So the text that I had that I was looking at and doing research around, I kind of created a script, a 75-minute script, where essentially here I'm reading the script in 3 different languages. So it's really a kind of, because of the 3 different languages being both Italian, French, and English, my languages were a way to signal, I guess, the kind of interweaving between my biography and Pasolini's biographies, or the parallels between these two different lives. Next slide, please. And can you just keep going? Next slide. That's a clip, but we don't really need to look at it. In 2005, I was commissioned by the New Zealand Film Archive, where I was living in New Zealand at the time, to make a work, or to have an exhibition of Pasolini. And I showed some of the earlier works, but I also made some new works, and specifically within their entrance hall, there was kind of like a cafe before you actually get to the exhibition and screening spaces. And again, I took this idea of subtitles. This work is called Sottotitoli, subtitles. And essentially, there are all the subtitles on the image on the right. I believe it's all the subtitles to Accattone and several of Pasolini's films. So I think it was Accattone, Mamma Roma, Comizi d'Amore, Teorema, and Salò, which to me were the sort of 5, at least in my lexicon, 5 probably the most important films for myself. So they became these kind of nonsensical, unreadable texts, obviously, that kind of floated in the, can I have the next image, please? In the windows that interfaced between the street and the actual film archive. Next image, please. And similar, related to that, was another work called Testi, texts, which again used this idea of the English subtitles, but created as either crawling or scrolling text, reminiscent of title sequences. I wish I could talk more about them, but I don't really have time. Next slide, please. And finally culminated in a written work called 5 Texts, Parallel Lines, which was a kind of a remake of an earlier work that I had done on the paper flower sequence, which is another short film that Pasolini made in the 60s. And here it was taking 5 texts around the making or the shooting of the paper flower sequence and reading across them. One is a letter to Allen Ginsberg, for example, and various other texts that were sort of presented in this kind of parallel fashion and meant to be kind of read across these sort of 5 different perspectives of a moment, of a historical moment, kind of a bit like Rashomon or something like that. Next image, please. So here we take a leap, and we move to 2013. I was an artist in residence at the British School in Rome, and was able to reacquaint myself, return back to Rome, where I had been a student there in the late 80s, and was able to return back. And in going back to Rome, I can't go back to Rome without having Pasolini, the specter of Pasolini, always around me. Next slide, please. And so I started to revisit, and I started to film. First, it was this idea of revisiting sites where Pasolini's films had been shot, which didn't last very long. I wasn't really interested so much in looking at kind of reconstructing Pasolini, but actually trying to look at my moment, my historical moment at the time, 2013, but through the optic of Pasolini, or along with Pasolini. And so one of the films that I always go back to, and because it's shot in Rome, and because it really is very much about Rome at a particular moment in Italian history, was Accattone. And trying to mine that film a little bit more than I had already mined it in the past. And there's the very, to me, pivotal scene, the diving scene from diving into the Tiber River, which had always struck me as being a really important kind of, and very symbolic kind of moment. Next slide, please. So I made a work called Punto, which happens around this. Those of you who are familiar with the film know exactly what I'm talking about. And I made a film, or I made a work about this moment where Accattoni here, shown on the bottom, these are stills from the film, is in response to something, has no words, and the only utterance he finds acceptable or relevant is to not utter any words, but actually to spit, which is a transgressive act, but a very important one and a very powerful one. Next slide, please. So I kind of take this moment and I extend it in a way in the film, and I project it large and so on and so forth. And if we can go to the next slide, please. If you can activate it. Thanks. And so this is just the part where he actually spits, but it actually, for a long time, he's actually kind of suspended. Even in the film, there's this moment where he really doesn't move much, and we sort of anticipate, and now here is the money shot. And so in the original film, of course, that would have gone by very quickly, but I luxuriate in it, in that transgressive moment, I guess. And we can go to the next shot, please. If you can activate it. Slightly better resolution, but you get the idea. I just love watching it, so you'll have to indulge me in this image. So to me, there was this way of mining Accattone, and trying to find at least in my eyes, there's a way in which, even though made in the early 60s and about an Italy that no longer exists, Pasolini's commentary, the fact that Pasolini would film an image, would script and film an image like this, I think it's an image that still resonates today, and who wouldn't want to spit in the eye of some politicians or whomever today. Next image, please. Another work from this residency was, there are two works really, Ponte Verticale and Ponte Orizzontale. Bridge vertical and bridge horizontal. So we're back to this bridge, the bridge of Accattoni's spitting. However, here we have two different works, two different kind of perspectives, a horizontal and a vertical perspective, is really kind of thinking much more formally in trying to order this kind of investigation. Can I have the next slide, please? So, and can you activate it? Thanks. So here we have the image of the famous diving image, and here again I slow it down. But not only do I slow it down, but I kind of modify the frame so that in the original film it's a pan, but here I kind of turn it into a crane shot or a pedestal shot that follows the slowly diving, but also very angelic. Obviously, here it's not only a diver, but what's evoked is an angel, right, floating in the sky. And so you see the frame now follows the diver rather than pans. So it's a formal restylization or formal retreatment, or however you want to call it, of the actual film. Not only is it slowed down, but it's kind of reframed, which is a perfect ode to this conference. A reframing of this image, literally in this case. So that's the verticale, the vertical aspect. But there's also the orizzontale, the horizontal aspect of Ponte. And those are the two images on the right. If we can go to the next image, please. So the two, what look like blank sheets of paper, can we go to the next slide, please? Oop, back one. Oh, that is there should be another slide after that. No, okay, sorry. Doesn't matter. the other site, there's two sites that I was drawn to in Rome in terms of revisiting. One was the Foro Italico, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, a sports complex built during the fascist period, which was inspired by the Roman forums of the imperial age. It's a vast complex in the north of Rome. The rotunda is the central point and is characterized by an elaborate circular mosaic illustrating fascist historical narratives and ideologies. So here we have Mussolini glorifying his fascist projects and his colonial projects and so on in these very Roman-looking, like black and white, graphic mosaics, and also the very famous statues that line the Olympic Stadium. These statues, which each represent a province in Italy. So there was a kind of narrative that the fascists were very, and certainly Mussolini was very, very engaged with, a visual narrative, architectural narrative that was constantly being articulated. And when I was much younger, when I was in my 20s, I photographed these statues. And I had sort of returned back to the site, and I didn't want to photograph them in the same way that I had photographed them at an earlier point of my life, when I was perhaps a little bit more naive about their kind of ideological implications. Can I have the next slide, please? So, so they're the mosaics, and I mentioned the mosaics because we'll be seeing how I filmed them in a minute. But there's also these monoliths which line the main alleyway going into the complex. Can I have the next image, please? And these monoliths, they're these marble monoliths, and on each one of these are significant dates in the history of fascism, the fascist narrative of Italy. But there is an anomaly in these monoliths. Those of you who read Italian will see on the right, Fine del regime fascista, the end of the fascist regime. That's the 25th of July, 1943. Now, obviously, the fascists did not chisel this and add it to the line of their history. This was a transgressive monolith, or a monolith that was meant to kind of disrupt the fascist narrative, Mussolini's fascist narrative. There was another one of these monoliths, which was, help me out here, I'm trying to find the date, I've forgotten it, of the birth of the Italian Republic, is the 2nd of June, 1946, I believe. So there are these two monoliths that were, that appeared and were installed after the fascist regime had collapsed. So they're kind of an interruption. They look like they should be there, but they're from another order. They're from the Republic of Italy, the democratic Italy, that has installed these dates and actually essentially truncating, at least in terms of the order of these kind of monoliths, which give these dates.
You have the 40-minute mark.
Okay, we're almost at the end. So, so these are the two dates. Can I have the next slide, please? And can I have the next slide, please? So that image became, that slide, or that monolith became these embossed works. They're indexical rubbings of these two dates that don't fit into the fascist narrative, the end of the fascist regime and the beginning of the Italian Republic. So to me, they were the vertical bridge that bridged a fascist Italy to a democratic Italy. Their indexical rubbings, that idea of indexicality, which is always so important to camera and recordings for filmmakers, for documentary filmmakers. Here, I try to take this idea of indexicality a step further. Can I have the next image, please? Next image. Of course, the specter of Gramsci also emerges at this time too. Can I have the next image, please? I also did a rubbing of of Gramsci, the word Gramsci or the name Gramsci. Next image, please. But I don't want to focus on that. I do want to talk about this site, which is the subject of the film that I want to screen. The Fosse Adriatine, which was the site of a mass killing of Italian civilians carried out by German occupation troops as a reprisal for a partisan attack. After the war, the site was declared a memorial and a national monument. And I show this location as a kind of counterpoint to the Foro Italico. Next image, please. Which was the subject of this work. This work, which has two iterations as an installation, which we'll look at, and as a film, which we'll also look at. So Foro Italico, Fosse Adriatine, Foro Fosse, 4-channel installation, where footage from both these sites are kind of presented together. And they're presented as video projections, but you can see from these images, can I have the next image, please? You can see from these images, actually, if we can go back to that video footage and just kill the sound, that'd be great, and I'll just talk over it. Go back one slide. Back one more. Okay, and if you can play that but kill the sound somehow. Thanks. So this video installation presents a walk through both these sites, both the Foro and the Fosse. And you can see that the screen onto which they're projected is kind of interrupted by these panels, these flexible plywood panels. The idea there is to, in a very literal way, interrupt the image and to also try to redirect the image somehow spatially. So you have both the soundtracks, the ambient soundtracks of both sites, but there's also an excerpt from a military hymn which uses the words La meglio gioventù lava sotto terra, which, if you've seen the film Salo, will recognize or will know that that military song, which is actually sung at one of the dinner parties that they have in Salo. And it's a kind of a chant of resistance. It's also a mourning, a kind of a mourning a song. And that sort of permeates through 6 channels in this installation. And maybe if we can add the sound now. Okay, or maybe not. Let's just keep going. It doesn't matter. So it's Le Ceneri di Gramsci, the ashes of Gramsci. That sort of, not only is it Pasolini spectre, but also Gramsci spectre that inevitably came through on this residency. Can I have the next slide, please? And then Murmurations Rome, which is a single channel, I wouldn't say version of Foro Fosse, but certainly uses the same footage or similar footage, but in a slightly different format, in a more linear format. It was actually commissioned for an exhibition called Thick Cinema. And it incorporates Pasolini's voice, reciting the Ashes of Gramsci, Le Ceneri di Gramsci, excerpts or fragments from that poem. So perhaps what we'll do is we'll screen that, and that's how I'll end up my presentation. And if there's questions, we can unpack it. About 10 minutes. If we can screen it, it's all right. They're short. We've negotiated the time.
Canadian dollars.
Qui il silenzio della morte è fede di un civile silenzio di uomini rimasti uomini, di un tedio che nel tedio del parco discreto muta. E la città esso c'è il grigiore del mondo, la fine del decennio in cui ci appare tra le macerie finito il profondo e ingenuo sforzo di rifare la vita, il silenzio, fradicio e infecondo. Questo silenzio. Silenzio. tra i due mondi la tregua, in cui non siamo. Nei cerchi dei sarcofagi non fanno che mostrare la superstite sorte di gente laica, le laiche iscrizioni in queste grigie pietre, corte e imponenti. Me ne vado, ti lascio nella sera che benché triste, così dolce scende per noi viventi, con la luce cerea che al quartiere in penombra si rapprende. E lo sommuove, lo fa più grande, vuoto intorno. Ma come io possiedo la storia, essa mi possiede. Ne sono illuminato, ma a che serve la luce? Ma io, con il cuore cosciente di chi soltanto nella storia ha vita, potrò mai più con pura passione operare, se so che la nostra storia è finita? Il silenzio della morte è fede di un civile silenzio di uomini rimasti uomini.
All right. Thank you, John. So, if that's okay, maybe we'll go with Fred, and then we'll take a short break, and then go with Katie. Is that okay? Thank you, Fred. These chairs are very good for your posture, I just noticed, so you have to sort of... All right, thank you, Fred. Go ahead.
So I guess I'll just say next. Okay.
You have to unmute.
Oh. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, that's the presentation. So Doug, I'm just going to say next whenever I want to go to the next slide. That'd be great. Thank you so much. I'd like to, let's give it a minute. Can we go to the beginning? Yeah, thank you. Great.
Let me just try it for 1 second.
Mm-hmm. Does it work now?
Let's try again.
All right.
But I'm back ready if that
Yeah.
fails.
Perfect. So thank you for being here. And also I'd like to thank John and Katie for inviting me to be on this panel with you guys. So first, whoops, I need to do this. Yes. So first, I must confess that I am an imposter. I'm an imposter on this panel on the influence of Pasolini on contemporary artists. Pasolini was not the starting point for the project I'm going to talk about, but rather a means to an end. So let me explain myself. In 2015, I was reading Cities of the Red Night by William S. Burroughs. And then one night, during the same period, I watched Arabian Nights by Pasolini. And I thought to myself that one could probably re-edit Pasolini's film to tell the story of Burroughs. The casting, the location, and some of the actions were ideal. Pasolini's homoerotic gaze was a perfect match for Burroughs' fantasies. It was a chance encounter. To the best of my knowledge, Burroughs and Pasolini never met. Pasolini was fascinated by the beat writers. He dreamt of casting Jack Kerouac as Jesus in the Gospel according to St. Matthew's, until he realized that the photo he was looking at was old. By then, Kerouac was a middle-aged, bloated alcoholic, not exactly Pasolini's type. Pasolini visited New York twice, in 1966 and 1969. He became a friend and a pen pal to Allen Ginsberg. Yet to me, Pasolini has a lot more in common with Burroughs. They were both radical visionaries, anti-conformists, and provocateurs. They were repulsed and enraged by bourgeois society, though both benefited from some of its privileges. They regularly traveled to Northern Africa and the Middle East, and have been accused of Orientalism. They had a taste for young, streetwise hustlers. Both experienced self-shattering experiences early in their careers that haunted them and propelled them to become writers. In 1951, while living in Mexico, Burroughs killed his wife, Joan Vollmer, during a game of William Tell while intoxicated. In 1949, Pasolini was accused of corruption of minors and obscene acts in public places. He lost his teaching position and was expelled from the Italian Communist Party. Both men are now queer icons who never fitted nicely within mainstream gay politics. If alive today, both men's life and work would no doubt be contested by the social media mob. As I continued reading Cities of the Red Night, I became obsessed with a very specific short passage, just a few sentences, in a complex book with multiple storylines spanning thousands of years, in many ways similar to 1001 Night. In the passage, Burroughs described lost ancient books that recounts the story of a plague caused by a virus that transforms fear into sexual frenzies and then back again into fear. The vicious cycle often leading to a fatal conclusion. This passage really struck a chord with me. I could not get it out of my head. First published in 1981, Burroughs' writing seemed prophetic. In 1981, the New York Times published its first article on a mysterious gay cancer. In Cities of the Red Night, Burroughs is not describing the AIDS pandemic. Still, it is shocking that he, the iconic queer junkie, would imagine a virus that closely connects desire, disease, and death at that precise moment in history. As someone who came of age during this terrible period, the AIDS pandemic had an immense influence on the formation of my identity, my sense of possibilities, my understanding of the fragile and ephemeral nature of life, and also my desire to become an artist. As a gay teenage virgin, I instinctively associated sex with death, a feeling that unfortunately persisted for too many years. In Fever Freaks, I rechannel this irrational, paranoid feeling of dread that I experienced as a teenager. So on a dare to myself, I decided to adapt this passage that so affected me by using footage from Pasolini's Arabian Nights. Could I use a film that was already the adaptation of a book to tell the story from a different book? Pasolini is no stranger to adaptation. Many of his films are based on books, myths, and stories. In the following edited quote, he describes his decision to turn the Gospel, according to St. Matthew, into a film. As soon as I finished my first reading of the Gospel, I immediately felt the need to do something, a terrible, almost physical energy. I had to do something. It was impossible to remain inert and efficient after such an emotion, so aesthetically profound, which I had previously experienced only a few times in my life. I said aesthetic emotion and sincerely, because this was how that increase of vitality came over me, as overpowering and visionary. I felt very similarly after reading Burroughs' book. In Cities of the Red Night, a detective is hired to find the lost copies of a series of books describing a plague in an ancient civilization. Instead of searching for the original, the detective decides to create new copies of the book. In Fever Freaks, using moving images, I decided to recreate the books that Burroughs had envisioned in Cities of the Red Night, but with a Pasolinian twist. They were picture books that used a strange color process to transfer three-dimensional holograms onto translucent parchment-like material. The 9-minute film had its premiere in October 2017 at the Festival du Nouveau Cinéma, right here in Montreal, and it's screened in over 25 international film festivals. It's distributed by Videograph and Video Databank, but it is also available for free on the internet. And now what we're going to do is we will watch this film. So, can we get the lights down, Doug? Thank you. Can you make it a little louder? Okay, as I said previously, in Fever Freaks, I decided to create the books that Burroughs had envisioned in Cities of the Red Night. To create the effect, I should do that. To create the effect, I selected sequences from Arabian Nights and rework each frame individually, cutting them up in Photoshop into layers where I would alter the saturation and opacity, adding color mattes, scan sheets of paper. It was a very tedious process that took multiple months. I became quite intimate with the bodies of the performers, bodies that were selected by Pasolini. Contamination is at the core of William S. Burroughs' work. There are countless instances of contamination in his body of work. It is connected to the junkie's experience as dope flows in their veins. It is associated with sexuality as violent and uncontrollable desire take over the character's mind and body. There is a lot of sex in Cities of the Red Night. There is also a lot of sex in Fever Freaks. Pasolini's trilogy of life is a celebration of self-expression, of sexual liberation, of innocent bodies and their sexual organs. Once completed, Pasolini rejected his trilogy. Consumer society had reappropriated these themes. Innocent bodies were violated and transformed by capitalism and consumerism. He no longer loved those bodies and those sexual organs. In the conservative and schizophrenic Trump #MeToo era, I felt a desire to return to the impulse of self-expression and sexual liberation. Arabian Nights may be part of a celebration of sexuality, but the sex in Cities of the Red Night was a very different affair. Thomas Ditch's 1981's review of the book in the New York Times declared that opium addicts who are sexually aroused by witnessing and or enacting strangulation and hangings will find Cities of the Red Night a veritable gallows of delight. In the same article, the reviewer makes a snarky comment about Pasolini's politics in Sallow, another chance encounter. Arabian Nights may be framed as a joyous exploration of pre-modern sexuality, but it has still provided me with plenty of dark and violent sexual scenes to illustrate Burroughs' tale. Pleasure and pain are always close cousin for Pasolini and Burroughs. In Burroughs' fiction, the metaphor of contamination is also a byproduct of the Cold War. The paranoid fear of the enemy infiltrating the nation and converting its citizens. Burroughs is obsessed with systems of mind control from various forms of authority. Often, all of these forms of contamination can coexist within a single paragraph. In the following recording, Burroughs reads a passage of an early draft of Cities of the Red Night, which did not make the final cut. The title of my video, Fever Freaks, is actually never mentioned in the actual book.
This reading is from a novel in progress entitled Cities of the Red Night. And this passage concerns a virus which occasions biologic alterations in those who survive, and these alterations are genetically conveyed, giving rise to a race of mutants known as the fever freaks. Some of these mutations are favorable and some otherwise. A top government official bluntly warned, virus B23, now loose in our overcrowded cities, is an agent that produces biologic changes in those affected, fatal in many cases, permanent and hereditary in those who survive and become carriers for that strain, which, as a matter of survival, they will spread as far and Monkeys, however, are only lightly affected by the virus and remain characteristically unchanged.
Contamination is also present in Pasolini's body of work. In Oedipus Rex, the oracle warns Oedipus, "Don't infect people with your presence." After killing his father, slaying the Sphinx, and marrying his mother, Oedipus becomes king. Subsequently, a plague occurs and kills much of the city's population. In Theorema, one could read the guest as an agent of contagion, infecting his host, the members of a bourgeois family. In his essay, The Electronic Revolution, Burroughs inadvertently offers us a concise synopsis of Theorema. Remember the life cycle of a virus: penetration of a cell, replication within the cell, escape from the cell to invade other cells, escape from the host to infest other hosts. End of quote. The visitor mysteriously arrives in a bourgeois household, seduces each member of the family, and disappears just as mysteriously as he arrived, leaving behind a mutated family in crisis. A divine visitation, a viral infection, either way, the guest has come to destroy. For Pasolini, contamination is above all an artistic approach. I work under the sign of contamination. The artist, he suggests, contaminates his work by appropriating styles, icons, and ideology from periods and work of art, producing not a random mixture, but an amalgam with a stylistic unity. That looks familiar, right? Pasolini often mixes the high and the low, most famously on the soundtrack of his earlier films, where he mixed sub-proletarian characters speaking in dialect with classical music, the apex of European high culture. The soundtrack for Fever Freaks is an original score. For the first time in my career, I worked with a musician instead of sampling downloadable music. After months of work on the image, I ended up with a very weird silent film. Pasolini was a proponent of shooting film without sound and dubbing everything during post-production. I usually create image and sound at the same time, or at least conceive of the soundtrack as I'm editing the image. But this was a very different kind of way of working for me. As I was creating the images alone for hours in my studio, I listened to a lot of experimental jazz from the 60s and the 70s, jazz from Ethiopia, and Afrofuturist music from Samra. The universe of Samra, combining ancient Egypt science fiction and 1970s funk-infused jazz, seem especially relevant. Chicago, where I live, has a wonderful contemporary jazz scene. I heard Ben Lamar Gay perform at the Experimental Sound Studio. His music was exactly what I was hearing in my head when I was looking at my film. I sent him a silent preview of the work, and thankfully he liked it. We met a few times to talk about the film, our influences, and our methodology. Ben Lamar Gay's bio state that he is a composer and musician who moves sound, color, and space through folkloric filters to produce electroacoustic collages. His unification of various styles is always in service of the narrative and never solely a display of technique. Ben Lamar Gay also works under the sign of contamination. The soundtrack we created did not play with contradiction between sound and image. Rather, it worked to move the story along. We acknowledge the Orientalism that was present in the work I was sampling. Both authors have Eurocentric fantasies of Northern Africa and the Middle East existing in a pre-modern state of innocence. It's in the work, it's embedded, it's unavoidable. We didn't shy away from Eastern and African influences. We also mixed in futuristic and punk elements, destabilizing the sense of time and space, which also permeates the narrative of Cities of the Red Night. Our influences were eclectic. And just to give you an idea of how Ben Lamar Gay works under the sign of contamination, here is the first clip that I play for him to give him an idea of what I was looking for. It's a great album. We should really listen to it at home. Okay, contamination is not pejorative for Pasolini. It leads to new combinations, to new texts, to new meaning. In an interview with Oswald Stack, cited in the introduction of Luca Peretti and Karen T. Riesen's book, Pasolini said, "Stylistically, I'm a pasticheur. I use the most disparate stylistic material. There is always a stylistic contamination in my writing." The dictionary on my MacBook Pro laptop defines pastiche as an artistic work in a style that imitates that of another work, artist, or period. And alternatively, an artistic work consisting of a medley of pieces taken from various sources. Fever Freaks is a medley of pieces taken from various sources. The sources were also medleys of pieces taken from various sources. The word is a virus, according to William S. Burroughs. The word is an organism with no internal function other than to replicate itself. Burroughs will forever be associated with the concept of the cut-up. Pages of text are cut and rearranged to form new combination of word and image. The page is cut with scissors, usually into 4 sections, and orders rearranged. Burroughs used this mashup technique in many novels. In Fever Freaks, I cut out sentences from my copies of City of the Red Night, scanned them, and inserted them between the scenes of Arabian Nights, creating a new narrative. Cities of the Red Night is a more traditional narrative. It is not one of Burroughs' cut-up novels, but it is still a work of appropriation. Burroughs was inspired to write the book after reading James Jones' detective novel, A Touch of Danger, and Stephen Lowe's research on gay parrots. Burroughs returned to all of his favorite themes and created new characters, doctors, agents, perverts, junkies, based on his own prior characters. In a lecture on creative writing and reading, he said that the concept of originality is now dead. New ideas and characters are no longer necessary, and that if a writer uses sets and characters from another writer, the new work should still be judged on its own merit. The word is a virus with no other internal function other than to replicate itself. Most words in this presentation were reproduced from other texts, including interviews with myself. 1001 Nights is a virus. It has infected hosts and spanned countless copies of itself over many years. It is unstoppable. It is a super spreader. Fever Freaks is a mutated copy, the 2017 variant, a very mild strain. The virus will survive, and it will be around when we are gone. Thank you.
If people want to take a break, that's fine.
Should we take a 10-minute break, and I'll see you back here at 3:50? Is that okay? Thank you. I love pre-gym bodies. Back on Zoom, back on live. I hope you enjoy your 11-minute break. It's always great to see pre-gym bodies, like bodies that had not been affected by the gym.
Yeah, totally.
Pasolini's films are full of these bodies, and they're so fantastic. And the contemporary culture doesn't allow us that, so it's kind of interesting. And I was thinking how great it is to see Pasolini's bodies after your take on birds and Gramsci. So two very different sides of Pasolini speaking to each other. So I thought that was very nice. If you are ready, I think we can start with
Awesome.
our other presenter. Oh wait, we'll wait for Fred.
Fred, all good.
And so we continue with our queer in Pasolini, and my first question is, how do you queer somebody who's so queer already? But before that, we're going to listen to Cathy Lee Crane talking about her engagement with Pier Paolo Pasolini. Thank you, Cathy.
Thank you. Well, as my text begins, to queer is to skew. And I want to think about the queering I do with Pasolini as a joust. Pasolini's last words, from which I will be showing a 25-minute clip, so nearly the second half of it, premiered in 2012 here in Montreal at the Festival de Nouveau Cinema. This experimental biography began when I saw a documentary about him in San Francisco in 2002, where almost as if in passing, it was declared that in the early 1970s, he was working on a novel about oil. My film began with a simple question: what was he doing writing a novel about oil? Petrolio's plot can be summarized thus. Oh yeah? Really? Yeah, here we go. Towards the end of the 1950s, the time of Italy's post-war, quote, economic miracle, the protagonist in Petrolio, Carlo Valletti, a young bourgeois from a liberal family from Turin, undergoes a sudden crisis and is split into two identical figures. The first, Carlo I, dedicates himself to the pursuit of power through his work for the petrochemical giant ENI and its shadowy connections with Christian Democrat and neo-fascist politics. The second Carlo, Carlo II, or Carl with a K, dedicates himself entirely to the pursuit of sexual pleasure. By the end of the 1960s, did you notice I leapt forward through the novel just then? Carlo II in Rome undergoes an epiphany on seeing young communists parading near Termini Station. He turns into a woman. We are now in the years 1972-74 when Carlo I experiences a lengthy vision of the degradation of popular society in the neo-capitalist consumerist 1970s and the terrorist campaigns. The, quote, unwritten ending of the novel was to have been an ill-defined but apocalyptic, quote, cosmic crisis connected to the oil industry and to terrorism. So the unfinished novel, Petrolio, with its careening and sadly timeless plot, is an invitation, as is the novel's project note, which John and I discussed at some length earlier this year in a conversation published in La Furia Umana. The note is a 2-page description of what the novel is not and what it could be and the ways in which it might intersect with a whole series of elements and documents, not just of a fictional rendering, but newsreels and interviews. The note concludes, quote, the fragmentary character of the whole book ensures that, for example, certain narrative pieces are in themselves complete, but we can't be certain, for example, whether they are real events, dreams, or conjectures made by one of the characters. Perhaps the woman Carlo became made Pasolini's last words, her conjecture. I come to Pasolini through his words and the process of figuration while reading them, the images those words conjure, which in my case is also suspended in the gelatinous miasma of translation. The biography I made concerns itself with the last year of his life and the material that he was writing during that last year. So Petrolio is a third of that biography. The novel's fragmentary nature is significant. Gaps in the stories and how the novel dilates around various nodes, the blowjobs, the Argonauts. How it is structured as notes, appunti. My film's own chapter structure utilizes the intertitle not just as a chapter heading, but also as a retroactive summary. My angle, or POV, is positioned from Pasolini's future, perhaps being pushed backwards if Benjamin's angel is to have its way. I am preoccupied with the historical trace in the present, perhaps that which resides in material objects and locations too. Michael Renov wrote in his infinitely fascinating essay Towards a Poetic of Documentary, quoting Helen Wendler, "The pleasure of poetics is not different from the pleasure of the scientists who advance, at first timidly and then with increasing confidence, a hypothesis that makes order out of the rubble of data. The rubble seems to arise and arrange itself into a form as soon as it is looked at from the right angle," unquote. I turn to biography because it is a modality through which I might intervene in history. Accepting the interpretive act that is biography, I was inspired by Isaac Julian's Frantz Fanon and Langston Hughes' biographies, also of writers. To enact, not as a way to seamlessly fill the missing historical record like reenactment does, but to stage an expressive mode of history telling, to perhaps point to the gap in the record that is wide enough for a history's future to be insinuated in it. To both draw attention to our distance from the past and to simultaneously present that past in the bodies of the subjects in front of us. Making order out of the, quote, rubble of data is the telling of stories we call history. To pick up those intersections with other stories that can be discovered topographically as a nexus or constellation of forces is a form of archaeology that refuses the linear causal logic underpinning many master narratives of history. This is what the hybrid form of documentary seeks to explore. We are in a meta moment where the question is, how do we make meaning? When anything is brought into relationship with something else, their subset, however small, is metaphor. Let us not sacrifice the possibility of multiple meanings in deference to a belief that there is only one. Even one that is in a constant oscillation from one to another in a binary of thought. Let us supersede language or enter the space of reflection, the space wherein language meets its own limits. I've been making what, for lack of a better word, is a poetic cinema. This I share with Pasolini. I think poetic, though, might be an adjective that now needs to be ripped asunder, so that which cannot be named directly does not dissolve. I want to find a way for us to think about image and sound relationships that indeed are not literal, but that once opened up as metaphor in the kind of Venn diagram of association that emerges, does not evacuate its sets for the subsets with which it can coexist. The subset that juxtaposition creates. Poetry can hold difference in a way that I think gets close to a kind of politics that Pasolini was interested in, which I am interested in, which is to, as he says, might allow for the diverse ways of being human. In my more recent work, I have been focused on Mary Louise Pratt's idea of the contact zone. Perhaps the binary itself is the problem, and the contact zone demands that we are not going to seek assimilation, and we're not going to accept compromise. In fact, living with difference, unresolvable difference, that is the queering I want. Okay, let's see a chapter of my film.
Ora, a me interessa questo sesso appunto come interessa De Sade, cioè per quello che è, ma nel mio film tutto questo sesso assume un significato particolare ed è la metafora di ciò che il potere fa del corpo umano, è la mercificazione del corpo umano, la riduzione del corpo umano a cosa che è tipica del potere, di qualsiasi potere.
I shall never tire of repeating that by speaking to you, I shall perhaps have the strength to forget or wish to forget what words have taught me. But I shall never be able to forget what was taught me by things. The education given to a boy by things, by objects, by physical reality, in other words, the material phenomena of his social condition, make that boy corporeally what he is and what he will be all his life. What has to be educated is his flesh as the mold of his spirit. Social condition is recognizable in the flesh of an individual because he has been physically shaped by the education, the physical education, of the matter from which his world is made. What things taught me with their language is absolutely different from what things taught you with their language. But the language of things has not changed. What has changed are things themselves, and they have changed radically. Let us look at a phenomenon that seems irrelevant. Recently, objects of the 30s and 40s have come back into fashion, and I am shooting a film which is set in 1944. I am therefore obliged every day, with that pitiless and cataloging eye that filmmaking demands, to observe the objects we were filming. During the last few days, I have been shooting a scene in which middle-class young ladies take tea. So as well as other objects, I have been seeing teacups. These cups had about them a mysterious quality. I could not look at them without a pang in my heart, followed by a profound feeling of discomfort. Things were still made or put together by human hands, patient, old hands. Then suddenly handicrafts and their spirit came to an end, just when you were beginning to live.
mountain quickly bear fruit. Evening primrose.
Ora invece succede il contrario, il regime è un regime democratico, eccetera, eccetera, però quella acculturazione, quella omologazione che il fascismo non è riuscito assolutamente a ottenere, il potere di oggi, cioè il potere delle civiltà di consumo, invece riesce a ottenere perfettamente, distruggendo le varie realtà particolari, togliendo realtà ai vari modi di essere uomini. E allora questa acculturazione sta distruggendo in realtà l'Italia. E allora io posso dire senz'altro che il vero fascismo è proprio questo potere delle civiltà di consumi che sta distruggendo l'Italia. E questa cosa è venuta talmente rapidamente che in fondo non ce ne siamo resi conto, è avvenuto tutto in questi ultimi 5, 6, 7, 10 anni. È stata una specie di incubo in cui abbiamo visto l'Italia intorno a noi distruggere, sparire, adesso risvegliandosi forse da questo incubo e guardandoci intorno ci accorgiamo che non c'è più niente da fare.
State fermi! Dai, state calmi! State calmi! State all'interno della piazza! Il servizio d'ordine faccia cordone attorno alla piazza!
Bisognava attaccare i civili, quello che è il popolo, le donne, i bambini, le persone innocenti e strane ad ogni gioco politico. Per una ragione semplice, perché bisognava obbligare questa gente, l'opinione pubblica italiana, a rivolgersi allo Stato, a rivolgersi al regime per chiedere maggiore sicurezza. Il ruolo della destra in Italia è stato proprio questo. Si è messa al servizio di apparati di Stato che hanno alimentato una strategia che giustamente è stata definita della tensione, in quanto bisognava portare la gente ad accettare in qualsiasi momento, nell'arco di un trentennio, dal 1960 al 1985-86, la possibilità di uno stato d'emergenza. Quindi la gente avrebbe barattato molto volentieri parte della sua libertà con una sicurezza, con la sicurezza di poter camminare sulle strade, viaggiare sui treni, salire sugli aerei, entrare in banca.
to the editor about the recent publication that came out alleging certain connections between politicians, right-wing conservative politicians, reveal the secrets of corporations involved in a nefarious power structure, securing certain markets for oil and or real estate development, industrial development, and using violence and the threat of violence, greed, and corruption in order to suppress what would be expected dissidents in the case of Italy in the 60s and 70s, the communists, and the use of bombings and blaming of anarchists or communists in the bombings. There's something of a intractable complexity. Tell the story in a very complex fashion in finance, develop, try to present power, story, the corporation, so many perspectives, and without still giving in favor of exposing so that it will always be so senseless or violent from multiple perspectives. It needs to be humanized. I need to start over. Maybe I'll look at my first draft here. It gives a fixity or immutability to the story and to the world that it makes it unchangeable. Yeah, I could call this monumental effigy to greed and corruption. It's like a piece of art that is being made over and over and over and over and over again. Smug retelling of the cynical tale of civilization. Yours truly, so-and-so.
Signore!
Note 19. Balance sheet. In conclusion, during the period of his return to Turin, as it remained /was scrupulously noted in Pasquale's stolen report, Carlo had complete sexual relations, and for the most part repeatedly, with his mother, with his 4 sisters, with his grandmother, with a friend of the last, with the family servant, with her 14-year-old daughter, with 24 girls of the same age, and even younger, with a dozen women in his mother's set. In addition, he had exhibitionistic relations which did or did not conclude with a certain sort of complicity or with an incomplete sexual relation such as, for example, masturbation, with at least 100 underage girls and as many older, but in any case under 20. He made use of half a dozen pimps and masturbated infinitely, delaying ejaculation, practically every time he found himself alone, even in public.
Dammi la mano, ti porto io a fine da Gennarì. Va, a casa sta a menù. Stai tranquillo.
Nella tua morte sei atterrate. Piangeva sempre che dormeva sola. Mororma con li morta accompagnate. Beh. Aiuto! Oddio mamma! Oddio mamma! Ai mamma! No! No! Ai! Ai! Aiuto! Aiuto! No! Ai! Aiuto! Aiuto! Non me lo sale qua sola! Non dico niente!
Je me représente à toi, toi te représente à moi. On dit comme ça. C'est une façon de dire napolitaine. Le cinéma, c'est la langue écrite de la langue naturelle de l'action humaine. Lénine a écrit un grand poème d'action et il s'est exprimé avec ce poème. Les hommes ont humilié, comme on dit. Les pauvres hommes, normal, les pauvres hommes, ils font des petits poèmes d'action. Mais tous ces poèmes modifient un peu la réalité.
Vedo il mondo come in fondo lo vedono quasi tutti coloro che hanno la vocazione poetica. Cioè come...
Thank you. So I know your film is available on online because I saw it online. So if anybody's interested in watching the rest of it, can do so, right?
It's true. It's streaming on Vimeo.
Yeah, that's where I saw it. Excellent, thank you. I guess we can open this up for discussion, conversation, questions. If you have questions for each other, if the audience has questions for them, or if the audience has questions for the audience, no. We have about 30 minutes, so we can use this time. Also, any of you who would like to join us at 6 o'clock, we will be at the Italian Cultural Institute, which is on 1200 Dr. Panfield. And there's going to be a reception for the speakers, so you're all welcome to come. So we were talking about queer in Pasolini. Maybe I'll start, right? So the interesting thing for me is that the idea of being queer for Pasolini is very different from our contemporary notion of queerness. And all of you obviously have addressed this Pasolini's queerness in your own way, and you have reused it in your own way. So my first question is, what is Pasolini's queerness? Whoever wants to start. Or what is Pasolini's queerness for you?
I'll take a stab at it, and I've
Go for it.
mentioned it in my presentation.
Oh yeah, sorry. You have to turn it on, I think. Yeah.
I can sum it up in. There we go. In one word, transgression. I mean, that's for me a queering strategy. I guess you can use it across epochs. Certainly, the time, the era in which Pasolini lived was mostly pre-Stonewall, right? It wasn't until 68, 69, that kind of turning point where there was a different kind of consciousness around, sexuality. So, but queering and queerness goes beyond merely sexuality, and I think I certainly saw that reflected much more in Fred's presentation by pitting or by relating Burroughs and Pasolini's kind of transgressive nature, right? It's like a methodology, we can say. So that would be my kind of more kind of simplistic, overarching way of talking about it. But I will say one thing too. There's a kind of an idea of about historicity that's embedded in all of these works, right? While looking at Cathy's clip from Cathy's work, I couldn't help but think about the Italian election of 2 days ago. Pasolini must be rolling over in his grave because all of Petrolio has actually come to fruition in the most banal kind of way, and yet terrifying precisely because of its banality. So in watching this clip, that's all I could think about. Rather than trying to pin queering as a definitive strategy or a definitive thing, I think it's a constantly mutating thing. Even when the term came to prominence, which is when I was younger in the 80s, when I was a student, it kind of meant one thing, and it was tied to one much more, I don't know how to say it, much more, I want to say simplistic, but that's not really the right word, much more a kind of restrictive kind of way. I think the idea of queering has opened up and is much more fluid today. How's that for a starting commentary? Perhaps someone in the audience might want to.
Maybe there's someone in the audience who wants to say something.
Yeah.
You have a mic for them?
If you can briefly introduce yourself.
Oh yeah, okay. I'm Gaia Giuliani. I'm mostly a philosopher and a post-colonial scholar, post-colonial studies scholar. So I'm going to present on the 30th on, let's say, the reading that Pasolini does of the figure of the subaltern, right? But I have a question for the three of you, which I really need, was work I really need to say that I appreciate so much, in the extreme variety, of course. I really believe that Pasolini's work, Pasolini queering work, is very inspirational. But then there is something that I want to, I'd like to historically contextualize, which is the relation between queering and the feminine, which was very problematic, let's say, in Pasolini. And I'd like you to spend a few words about that, if you never encountered that, if you you may want or you might want to develop on that, because, I mean, for Pasolini, the feminine was not radical. The feminine was not revolutionary. If we compare the figure of Pasolini with that of Mario Mieli, that was very contemporary, the difference is striking, right? Because it doesn't embrace femininity, while, of course, on the contrary, Mario Mieli was embracing femininity as a revolutionary kind of political item, right, in the public sphere. And at the same time, he loves the feminine, and I'd like you to talk about what you think about that. So I would just stop here. Thank you. Thank you very much, again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The thing about Petrolia that's interesting to me is not only that this protagonist becomes a woman, and what does that mean? Because ultimately that woman will be evacuated and recuperated. Whatever the experiential honorific ideas that she proliferates in the novel doesn't last, and it ends only with men. And there's a way in which the end of my clip that I showed, that's a restaging, there's a restaging of the idea that his murder scene was that scene already seen in Akatone, which is like this doubling over of identification that he himself may have had with the feminine. I'm worried about the total evacuation of, I mean, as a feminist, obviously, with the total absence. So I'm interested more in him as queer. That's why I say it as a verb, a skewing thing, because I think of him more as a polemicist, and I'm interested in how he thinks through not gender. I don't want to think about, I think primarily with him about politics and how he's going to understand how we erase our own diversity. And he was afraid in the last year of his life. He wrote, I could never remake Akatone because I can't find these bodies anymore, anywhere. They're gone. Why are they gone? Because you can learn to, through whatever, capitalism and advertising, learn how to mimic oneself to the complete erasure of all aspects of being a diverse human being. In fact, the reason that those actors could exactly enact that sequence from Akatone was through repetition. exercises of repetition. We had no idea we would be staging that later in the day. But they had gone through it so many times, getting out of the car, going around the car, going around the car, going around the car, going around the car, that they could actually do the car. So I'm interested in that problem of erasure, which is much deeper. It's not that I want to not think about the sort of anti-female violence against women, of course, also in Akatone there is worth considering, obviously. We have to think about that. We have to think about that. I mean, we're all being dissolved, I mean, on some fundamental level right now. So we're all in it together. And maybe women were the first to experience that.
Actually, I have a question to follow up that question. Yeah. One of the things I thought was really radical in your work was the use of, I assume your voice. No, my lead. Okay, the actress' voice to actually to read some of the text and sort of the confusions that sort of arise from that. And I would really like to hear about that choice, because sometimes it's his writing, other times I'm assuming it's your writing, you know, so, but using the feminine voice for that I thought was really interesting and subversive. Yeah, I mean, the female voice in reading Pasolini is, yes, that was a decision, that was just an attempt to try to bridge the problem in Pasolini, basically. And maybe he was addressing it, maybe he was coming close to confronting it. Who know? We have no way of knowing when he was murdered. I mean, it's possible. There are women throughout Petrolia who have very central roles in refusing him his speech. Actually, there are obstacles to him. So I wanted to, I don't know, yeah, confusion I think is a good idea. Otherwise, it's like, I think of myself as following Pasolini, as following Dante, as following, so I'm in the caboose and there's a woman in the caboose. Okay, it's not the first time.
I'll just kind of will make a comment in relationship to the feminine, I guess we can say. Pasolini, at least in my eyes, was a product of his own generation, of a certain generation. He's certainly not perfect. I mean, he was anti-abortion. I mean, we can list all of the things that would make him kind of suspect. In a certain way, he was still a radical in many ways. So it doesn't condone anything, but I think, I've always felt this about Pasolini, that he was himself perhaps kind of homophobic. I think he had a real hard time with that aspect of sexuality. So kind of following from my previous statement, I think we need to be careful about sexuality and queering. Certainly at the beginning of the kind of genesis of using the term queer, sexuality and queer were like this. Now they're kind of separated out. It's become much more complex. What would Pasolini say about trans? I shudder to think. I don't know, but based on what you're alluding to. However, nobody's perfect, and I think that there's a kind of way in which that has to be acknowledged. And in the piece that I kind of glossed over, there is a section about his body, that picturing Pasolini, where I talk about Pasolini even refusing his own aging gay body. By dressing in a much more young way and so on and so forth. So to me, those are all indicators. Now, we can't go back to 1972 or whenever those photos were taken, but I can read in between the lines. As myself an aging man of that age, I can kind of, and also of someone who kind of comes from a background raised by people from that generation. My parents were that those are things that are inculcated in me and which I've had to address in terms of my own sexuality, in terms of my own internalized homophobia. So that's all I would like to say in terms of Pasolini, not to condone, but also to contextualize his own inability to deal with that idea of sexuality. But I think that gave a lot of fruit, despite the potentially negative aspects of his, let's call it internalized homophobia or whatever you want to call it. It was almost like fuel, I think, for him. Tom, you've raised your hand. You want to add to that?
Do we have a mic for Tom? Tom, tell us who you are.
Tom Waugh, formerly of Concordia. Briefly, in answer to your question, I think the answer has to be extremely complicated by the historical construction by Pasolini of the diva, the filmmaker who created Mama Roma and Medea and Silvana Mangano, called into question around feminizing, needs a very, very complex analysis, in my opinion. And also Laura Betti, who ran the whole Pasolini heritage until we took it over here in 2022, didn't she? But more in response to queering, I think I'll get this off my chest tomorrow, but just very, Friday, but very briefly, when you said the word transgressive, John, I thought, why is that ringing a bell? And the Cinémathèque Québécoise has totally confused my brain by programming a big Pasolini series and a big Bruce LaBruce series together, confusing everyone, myself included. And the title of the Bruce LaBruce series is Transgressive et Tendre, transgressive and tender. And I think, John, your definition of queering has to include both terms, because the very intense tenderness of Pasolini for his male bodies that all of you have been showing, for example, is really part of the picture and needs to enter into our conception of queering. I'm going all over the place. That's all for now, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. If anybody, oh, yes.
I mean,
Fred.
maybe in response to that, I mean, I can totally spending hours and hours and hours looking at those bodies myself, cutting them up from their frames. It became this really amazing way of seeing how often, there's moment that I actually didn't use in my film where he takes revenge on his lover in the film by castrating him. But most of the time, that's not what the footage is about. It's actually incredibly loving. And that was really, really beautiful to actually work with, and actually to kind of fall in love with these people who are probably no longer, in my studio by just spending so much time with them. So absolutely, that's definitely a big part of what Pasolini is about too.
And Ninetto, we have to say, right? His continual affection, both behind the scenes and on screen, of Ninetto and Ninetto's body, etc., etc. I think that's an obvious reference as well. But I agree with you, Tom. I think there's a complexity to it, and yeah.
John, what I found interesting is, sorry, I lost everything. It's all coming undone. It's the transgression. Anyway, what I found interesting is that Pasolini, we always said that Pasolini was a bad Marxist, right? Because he was never following the party. He was doing the things that the party didn't want him to do. He was avant-garde when the party wanted him to be socialist, realist, and the other way around. But in the same way, we can say that he was a bad homosexual, right? And Gaia's comment about Miele is perfect, right? He was not part of the movement recently, and we have a copy here if you want, of the magazine Fuori, F-U-O-R-I, which stands for Fronte Rivoluzionario Omosessuale, which was the movement started by Mieli. And the edited collection of the original are now available. We have one of the 500 copies here. If you like to know, Gucci, the fashion house, just made a series of outfits based on the covers of Fuori, so the latest collection that was just shown in Paris. It's all based on the Fuori covers that you can find here in the library. So he was a bad homosexual. He always said the wrong thing, never participated in the liberation movement, was never in any possible way pre or post Stonewall. He didn't care about Stonewall. He always talked about his homosexuality as being totally Freudian. He said many times that he was homosexual because he loved his mother. Right? So he was in many ways, politically speaking, as much a bad Marxist as he was a bad homosexual. And yet, Marxists love him now, and queer, gay, any sort of new people interested in new sexuality dig Pasolini out. So I presume it is because of this contradiction that are so evident in his work, in his life, in his speeches, in his political and artistic writing, that is so rich, precisely because it's so difficult to bring him together. So the tenderness versus the body is, and the sort of erasure of the female representation is matched by the creation of the diva that Tom pointed out. So I presume it is precisely this massive amount of contradictions that make him such a rich character.
I would agree with that. I don't think there is a bad homosexual in terms.
Oh, there is.
Well, in terms of discourse, I mean, I think he was a nonconformist, and he was a nonconformist to a certain kind of gayness or whatever it was, right? So that's how I'd like to, and we can only say this with historic, with retrospect, right? But I think what you're pointing out is very important. I think we do need to look at history as a kind of continuum. And Pasolini went in and out of favor. Even his films, right, went in and out of favor. Now everything that Pasolini ever made is a masterpiece. Well, not so much at any given moment. I named my 5. But let's talk about Paper Flower Sequence, which is a really weird film, full of contradictions, full of inconsistencies, and yet the subtext of that film is precisely his love for Ninetto, right? I mean, it's a love story to Ninetto, even though it's supposed to be about God's wrath on the whatever, right? That's what makes Pasolini so rich. I think you said it really well. It's all of those kind of contradictions, quote unquote, that make him a multi-dimensional kind of figure that we can mine today. I could go on.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to this diverse ways of being human scenario that he's describing, which is that he's a bad, not Marxist. He's a great Marxist. He's a bad communist. And maybe he's also bad queer, but he is not, I don't think he was interested in these groupings. He was also a really bad Catholic. How does he come to Matthew? He comes to Matthew in a way that wants something else to exist in the story. Whether it exists, whether it is in fact a subtextual fact of the book of Matthew, I don't know. I mean, the Bible isn't a completely homoerotic text, and we have no way of knowing that because the church is not interested in that. He was a polemicist. This is the thing about him. He wanted to explode the whole operation, where we think we understand anything, including him. Which sounds very apolitical, and he was not that.
But for example, I know that both Tom and I taught Pasolini in very different ways, I presume, at Concordia. And yet, what is kind of interesting is to think that right now, the way in which bodies, the ideology of his films in terms of queerness do not speak the same language of today. And yet, there seems to be something this is something that is to me completely fascinating. The fact that it's way more rich, Pasolini, than some instead sort of better queer or better homosexual, more politically aligned. It would be interesting to compare maybe Pasolini and Bruce LaBruce. Maybe we'll do that on the next conference. You know, I mean, in a way, maybe Bruce is more of a good queer versus Pasolini. I don't know.
They're both bad.
Okay.
Okay. Do you have any last question, or somebody wants to make a comment?
If I think about Raspberry Reich and the demystification, Raspberry Reich, Bruce LaBruce, if I think about demystification of the Rote Armee and how he plays with that in order to valorize a piece of a story, the German story, but at the same time somehow deconstructing and putting something very kind of a, let's say, contradictory elements for that story, which is sexuality, is something that it is revolutionary, but it's not at the same time in that context. But pretty much Pasolini is in many different ways. If I rethink about Pasolini, but then I mean, of course, it was not my aim to moralize or remoralize Pasolini. Pasolini is a figure, as an historical figure for me. And with all these contradictions. But when I say that, I'd like to go more deeply into his idea of femininity is as a metaphor, is as a fictional characters, as he talks to girls and women in his political writings, and so on and so forth. It's very complex. It's something that actually cannot be reduced just to one shot, I really believe. But I have a question for John, which is, I mean, Pasolini is it is very interesting how he deals with fascism. And at a certain point he says that sub-proletarians could not be fascist because fashion was against their interest. Well, but yeah, so it is very interesting, your operation, in the sense that it's an operation that goes back to memory and relates through Pasolini what happened in particular moment, which was the long period of fascism, so Foro Romano and Fosse. But it's very interesting, it would be very interesting to see how Pasolini was controversial regarding his idea of the grandeur of fascism and the possibility for the poor, the miserable, the crips to adhere to that, which is something that comes out from La Vita Violenta, Una Vita Violenta, or Ragazzi di Vita. So I'd like, if you want to expand on that, if you have anything to say. Thank you.
I think, thanks for that. Let's take those early novels, you know, Una Vita Violenta. Compare that to Petrolio. We see the trajectory right there. We see the trajectory, and in fact, even those clips of Pasolini on that beach, you know, in desperation, you know, pleading to us that this is happening and we must stop it, and yet we can't stop it. You know, he even says it, you know, all we can do is recognize it, and it's already, the ship is already gone. So that's how I would answer that. I think that even Pasolini has an arc, right, of his own realization, and pretty dark by the time we get to Petrolio, right? So I think that kind of says it for itself. He is, in a way, a victim of history, like we all are. And in Murmurations, certainly the last couple of quotes that I pulled from that, or that little vignettes that I pulled from that poem, were talking exactly about this. That history, we can only really be, and I know this is going to sound terrible, but we can only observe history. Sadly, you know, Pasolini spent his whole life trying to literally put his body on the line, and yet we still have Petrolio, right? That's not an answer. It's very pessimistic. I'm sorry. It's not a great way to end the conference or whatever, or the session, but that's
just the beginning. So
or I mean, or the session.
Days, yeah.
But I really believe that, and I say that because I'm also observing what's happening right now in the world. Yeah, I'm. Do I want to talk about the Italian election? Maybe not.
Well, Carlo becomes a woman, so it's perfect for the new, you know, the new fascist.
Well, it's not. I don't even think it's about that. I think it's about something else. Yeah, and what really struck me and it really kind of hit me was watching Cathy's that clip from Cathy's film where it really was, in his own words, you know, this is exactly what has happened. It's not a proposition anymore. It's a reality. The ignorance of that is the fruit of consumerism, et cetera, all these things that Pasolini's ranted on for his entire career. We are living it.
And who knows if he knew about the strategy of tension, because that was not even something that was, you know, officially acknowledged until the early 90s. That was actually a right-wing intention to foment insecurity in domestic life. That was the purpose. So that, I mean, just like this guy who's actually, that's not Pasolini's language in the redacted section of Hello, the Pasolini Park outside of Bologna, which is where all of that is staged with those figures in the grass surrounded by housing projects, which is an extraordinary location, by the way. But anyway, I'll go off on a tangent.
Well, thank you. We have 4 more days to go off on different tangents, so I hope you'll join us for some. I hope you will join us. Oh. I hope you will join us. There's a horrible show in Quebec called Tout le monde en parle, which has exactly this setup. So I'm going to propose to the Quebec TV to have this panel brought on national, quote-unquote, provincial television. So maybe we'll have some fun there. Thank you for coming. 6 o'clock, Italian Cultural Institute 1200 de Pamphile. Thank you all. Thank you to the speakers. And see you soon.
Okay, and with that, we're going to close up Zoom. Thanks so much for those of you who joined us in that space. It's been great to have you here with us. And on the live stream, we saw a lot of people watching. So just a reminder for all of you who joined us here today, if you want to access this talk again at a later date, it's available at Concordia University's Fourth Space YouTube page. That is such a mouthful. All right, thanks very much for being here. Bye, everybody.